Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists and honored guests, my name is Tsietsi Shuping. I'm the acting head of legal department for the Commission for Gender Equality. Mine today is to moderate this session, the discussion regarding gender, human rights, and the environment. As we convene this panel discussion, we are reminded that the struggle for human rights is linked to the fight for a sustainable environment. The degradation of our planet's natural resources has devastating consequences for the marginalized communities, exacerbating existing inequalities and injustices. Let this discussion amplify the voices of those most affected. With those, can we please, with a round of applause, welcome our panel that has already joined us. Given the theme on our panel today, we are joined by Mrs. Valerie Jean. Can we give a round of applause, please? We are also joined by Dr. Pulane Molokwane. We are joined by Ms. Louise Naude. And lastly, by Ms. Penny Gasela. Right, I've noted, I'll just move a little bit different from some of our moderators for today. Our panelists, I wish you a fruitful engagement in this discussion. And I think as a start to this topic and given the caliber and the knowledge that you are having on the subject matter, I'll start with the questions to each of you. And then once we have time that is left, you can also use the opportunity to present what you would have wanted to say to the audience today. In that regard, I think our first question, I would like to pose it to Dr. Molokwane. Can you please tell us, what do you understand at the intersection of gender and climate change?
Can you come again? Oh. For me, what really matters the most is the fact that we need to have women and girls centered as we get to discuss climate change. We would all remember that the report launched at COP28 actually estimated that by 2050, about 158 million more women and girls would be pushed to poverty. So you cannot have that conversation without it being gender-centered and gender-centric.
Yes, and in as far as your expertise is concerned, what are the major circumstances or those effects that you have observed in as far as the environment on gender issues, women or vulnerable persons?
Particularly when it comes to women, women are the most affected by climate change. As we all know, environmental changes could actually result in birth defects. That is only will affect women, not any men. It could result in birth defects and even to a certain extent death. So that is just one of the many, let alone the fact that when there is natural disasters or any form of disasters as a result of climate change, women are the most affected because they are the most that are caregivers.
Yes, thank you. The next question that I will pose, and without restricting other panel members also to share their view on various questions, I would like to ask Ms. Naude regarding what can we expect from the state regarding its preparedness to address climate change?
Thank you, moderator, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Louise Naudé. I work for an organization called WWF South Africa, and I'm also a presidential climate commissioner. So firstly, I just want to say, I think the title of this panel, making this climate change issue be about the environment, it is first and foremost and centrally about humans and the impacts on us. Of course, plants, animals, soil, water is all affected, but let us not think it's something we need to put in a box called environment. So in 2022, the Cabinet of South Africa adopted something called the Just Transition Framework. And that was a document developed through wide consultation by the Presidential Climate Commission. And I would recommend that people, find that on the Commission's website and read it. And it outlines what is, what do we understand by a just transition and what the world should look like after a just transition. And in there, it's not entirely gender blind, but it is very weak on gender. And so I don't think this country, not the Commission, not women's organizations, have a proper agenda for gender justice in the just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. And so I would like to speak about, what that agenda should be for gender justice in the just transition. And out of that, I think, would fall, where does the state have a role?
Yes, you may proceed with discussing. Say.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
So I think there are two dimensions we have to think about, and you will cut me when I go on too long,
yes.
Please. The one is the biophysical impacts of climate change. So it's, the changing weather patterns, rainfall patterns, extreme weather events, heat, etc. All of those things in the biophysical space have an impact that is gendered. And then we also need to think about the low carbon transition, which is an enormous economic upheaval all around the world. And, what are the gender issues in that transition? So let me first speak about the biophysical. There's a lot of literature, and I mean, my fellow panelists already referred to some of the issues. There's a lot of literature which argues that women are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And I have a reservation about that. Because I think men and women, because of their gendered position economically and in society, have different kinds of vulnerabilities in the face of climate change. I don't think women are more vulnerable. I think they are differently vulnerable. And in order to make them less vulnerable to climate change impacts, I think it's all the things that this conference is talking about. It's economic inclusion of women. It's when they do have a job, equal pay for equal work. It's stop gender-based violence. And all of those things, will allow women to be more resilient in the face of climate impacts. But I did think about, how will these climate changes, the biophysical changes, manifest in women's lived experience. And I think there's three areas which are key. The one is water, the other is food, and the third is health. And these are going to, impact particularly for women because of our position in society. Not because we are, I don't need to tell this forum, it's not because of intrinsic properties of women, but because we are often the ones responsible for food in the household, for water management in the household, and for caring for people who are not well or are elderly or disabled. So I think those are three arenas where we really need to look at what is gender justice in those three arenas in the context of climate change. Shall I stop?
Yes,
I
thank
can
you.
say other things later.
Yes. Can you just also just give in the context of the climate change that we have seen in the country, the floods in the KZN, the heat waves in the Northern Cape provinces, and the work of your commission? What are those nuances that you have discovered that the commission in as far as the response and policies in addressing such disasters in the country?
So we are doing a lot of work on adaptation and resilience, and we have done sort of specific case studies of, you know, the KZN floods, of other examples where climate changes have really bitten, and we've made recommendations in that regard as to how to do better the next time something like that happens. Yeah. So we are working on that.
Thank you. To Ms. Casella, can you take us through the, given the current policies, documents, prescripts that are available in the country, how would you now gauge the climate change in as far as our response to it in the country as well as internationally? When you compare us to other countries internationally, how would you gauge our response to climate change?
Thank you very much for that question. I think South Africa, we have beautiful policies. I think that's one to start with. We have the recently signed Climate Change Act, which the President signed in July, that speaks to our response to climate change. And there's also the National Adaptation Strategy that also speaks to how we need to respond in terms of climate change adaptation. And that National Adaptation Strategy reflects the roles of women. It has an aspect of gender perspective to it on how we respond to disasters that happened. We also submitted the nationally determined contribution that was after the Paris Agreement, which was signed in, which was agreed in 2015. And South Africa has submitted their nationally determined contribution, which is a way of saying this is our commitment to the international community. Whilst our nationally determined contribution does not speak clearly on what the roles are for women there, it is gender quiet. Now, with the new nationally determined contribution that is coming up, which we're supposed to be submitting, we're advocating for the voice of women to be heard, you know, so that at least we recognize the inequalities and how the response to climate change needs to be responded to, looking at different gender roles.
Thank you. And in as far as the negotiations that you have been involved in or you have observed, generally regarding these discussions, what are the difficulties or challenges that are involved in this negotiation in embracing the gender equality and in addressing the climate change to dismantle the discriminations that is caused by its responses?
Internationally, there is the Gender Action Plan that of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That in itself is in the gender and climate change negotiations, wherein it's trying to recognize the importance of women in the negotiations and how in the negotiations there needs to be more women representatives. Now, if you look at historic negotiations in the international fora, it has mainly been men who are predominant in these negotiations. And that in itself makes it difficult for women to penetrate the space. But from the South African perspective, we have, at least I can say, we have more than 50% of our negotiators that are women. So I think we have balanced the gender issues there. Now, in terms of the whole of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is also speaking about the 50-50 representation in decision-making, which is something that becomes important in the negotiation. So I want to think that there's strides being made to ensure that there's gender equality, but I think that more can still be done.
Thank you. Just one other question regarding the work that you are doing with Department of Fisheries, Environment, Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. What can we expect from the department and from the work that you have been observing at the department or its report addressing these issues of climate change?
Currently, in fact, I was just talking to one of your colleagues that we are busy working on the South Africa's Gender Action Plan ourselves, because once we have this Gender Action Plan from the UNFCCC, from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we then need to translate it into our own national policies. So that's what we have been doing. So far, we've had provincial consultations on having SA's National Gender Action Plan on how we responded. We've been working with all departments as well as all stakeholders in terms of how we would want to see gender reflected and having gender responsive policies. That's one of the things that we've been doing. We also have a gender focal point from the department that is responsible for coordinating all gender related issues. And we intend to work more collaboratively with the gender commission to ensure that this does not only become a policy that gathers dust, because like I said, we have beautiful policies, but what we need now is to move from just having policies to implementation and not just talk, because we've been having a lot of these dialogues where we talk about the importance of gender equality and so on, yearly. And my thing is that we need to move beyond just talking, but taking action. And not just action, but implementable action that will have impact on the people on the ground. That's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. To our audiences, please prepare your questions for the panel. Please, I will request you to direct the question to maybe a specific panel member, unless they would want to address it in general, it's fine. As I will be taking another question in the meantime, you can prepare the questions. To Mrs. Jean, can you take us through what do you understand about the role of public sector as well as its relationship with government about disaster management and rapid response?
Good morning, Chair, and good morning to the audience. My name is Valerie Geen, and I'm the National Coordinator for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. I know it's a mouthful, but I think I needed to say it because what I wanted to do before I answer your question was just marry the word environment with economy. That our organization is about sustainable industrial development. And I think a lot of the challenges that women face are whether they are inside or outside of the economic landscape of the country. So I'm going to speak, to answer your question, I'm actually going to speak about work that we've done. I'm happy that I'm following on PEMI because part of our work has actually touched on the work that PEMI does. In 2021, we released a research report where we did a feminist critical analysis of about 10 policies in the country. And as she rightly points out, we've got beautiful policies, How much they say about gender is an interesting point, and whether they actually evolve into implementation is another one. So, first of all, I'd just like to say that from our findings, reviewing 10 policies, they included the National Development Plan, some of the climate policies, the energy policies, etc., all the green industrial related policies. Out of those, we found that 5 out of the 10 of them at least mentioned gender. The other 5, or 6 out of the 10 did not make any reference to what they were going to do about the fact that they mentioned gender. So that was a starting point. But I want to perhaps, I can answer some of the other points of what I'd like to say later, but to your points about the public sector. I think that's important. The public sector obviously has the first and fundamental role to play in framing how you deal with disaster management. And the project that I ran, we had a limited time span for it. We're running it again for this year. And our focus this year is far more on the implementation component, because our first run of the project was to say, if your policies are not looking at gender, you don't have a strategy, etc., how do we assist you? This year it's more focused on helping to do some capacity building around that. But that's not enough. It takes budgets, it takes commitment, it takes political will, etc. On the issue of disaster management, we've just, in our most recent configuration of the work we're doing, have included SALGA, because we thought it was important for SALGA to be represented, representing local government, because disaster happens right here, locally, in your different contexts. And we know that when we talk about climate change, we're going to see higher sea level rises in the coastal areas. We're going to see higher precipitation or less precipitation in others. We're going to see hotter temperatures in others. So our contexts vary. And so our local governments need to respond according to their context. But I know already, and I've heard it said in recent flood disasters, etc., that local government is not capacitated. They don't have budgets to deal with something that's right in front of them. And I think that's the starting point. So public sector has a responsibility, but it has to move beyond the national lens to the provincial and local lens. And then women, because I'd really like to take a stab at answering your question that you asked earlier about women. From the way I see it, if women are located in mostly in 2 sectors of our economy, which are the services industries, and 75% of our women are in private households. And so they are almost missing from all the key economic sectors of our economy. And even where they are there, they're in the lower rungs of that economy. So they don't have the resources. So when you talk about a woman-headed household being attacked by a flood or a cyclone or a tornado, whatever, the resources in terms of money to rebuild that house, or to even have a house that can withstand that disaster. You also find that the infrastructure collapses. Last year, I think it was citrus drought, and it happened again, I think this year, got cut off. And farm workers, who quite often are women, can't get to work, can't sell their products if they're traders. So it's those sorts of issues that women are very vulnerable with because of where they are located in the economy, and therefore our policies from the public sector have to be responsive to that. And lastly, much as we're saying the public sector has a role to play, part of it I think also is a lot about education, because are all those women aware that the temperatures are going to rise, and what does that mean? Are they all aware that they're prone to flooding, and what does that mean, etc.? There is also a very significant role for the private sector. And one of the key roles that the private sector, you would have seen it, especially with the big flood incidents in KwaZulu-Natal, was the issue of insurance. That when buildings, and even when there were other troubles in KZN, insurance had to come to the fore, and many of them, they didn't have enough money to pay out the bills. They had to be underwritten and supported to pay out insurance. Because not only is it a question about whether you are insured as an emerging farmer or a household owner, but your job might disappear. It might just have been washed away, and suddenly, even if you were a packer or a teller or whatever, you don't have a job to go to. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Molokwane, given that it's clear that there is need for collaboration and for departments and private sector to work together, can you tell us about your experience regarding maybe cooperative governance or collaboration in this regard, particularly in ensuring that the most vulnerable receive services during disastrous times?
The one thing that I always lash on, even when, as the National Planning Commission, engage with Cabinet and Parliament and the different committees, is that we are so uncoordinated as a nation. To a certain extent, I don't believe that we've got a resource issue or a money issue, a money problem. We've got a coordination problem. We do have relatively the right legislation, policies, frameworks, you can name them, statements that we make, but we fall short on implementation. In our latest activities as the Commission, together with the Minister Ramokgopa, we are trying to make sure that all spheres of government plus the private sector talk to each other and we work towards the same thing. It cannot be correct that the most vulnerable people are the ones that are largely affected and situated in municipalities that cannot even perform or save them when there are disasters. And if you really, even if we really would expect the municipalities to assist those that are vulnerable, they don't have the resources because most of those people are not like ratepayers. They are barely employed. They are old people and women that are even looking after their grandchildren, and they are unemployed. So we need to make sure that as a state we address those kind of things. It needs a multi-pronged approach in a way. For women to end up being in a boardroom or in a place of decision making, it does not happen overnight. So we need to start with our girl children. We need to make sure that they are aware of the opportunities and try to get as many of them to school. You know, I always say to people, when I went to school, I wanted to be a medical doctor because that's probably the nicest thing and the biggest thing that I knew. And I got to learn when I was in matric that there are actually nicer things. And when I got to university, it even got more interesting. I ended up in the nuclear space. And as I was in there, I ended up in the environmental engineering space. So when you don't know what you don't know, you think the little that you have and see it's all that. Maybe we need more, purpose-driven interventions to go to those areas and make sure that girl children know that they, I grew up in a village and my mother has always told me that your ticket out of poverty, is school. So I did not know any other thing but the ticket out of that village and out of poverty, and for me to break the cycle of poverty was going to school. A lot of these girls, they think when they go to their local school, they can just stop at any time because, when I hear people say, I did not have money to go to school, and I say I was raised by an unemployed woman, but I went to school. And once I said to one girl, just read your books. When you read your books, your marks will get you the money to get to school. But not everybody actually has got that understanding. And maybe we owe it to those girls in the far-flung areas to go there and for them to even see people like them, for them to understand that it's really possible. Because no matter what we like to say or don't want to say, the face of vulnerability and poverty remains largely black and African. So we need to be intentional about removing those girls from those environments. And the state must, as the chairperson has said yesterday, the state owes it to those kids to have those interventions. But at the same time, the state cannot do that on its own. We also need other sectors to come into the play so that we can all work together to improve a country. We're not going to have a better nation if we have a nation that is largely women-headed. I mean, close to 70% of households in South Africa are led by women, and most of them are actually unemployed. They rely on grants. And how are they even going to do it for their children, even if they wanted? You know, so we need to be very intentional and probably move away from having talk shops. Let's just get our hands dirty and be on the ground and do it.
Thank you. I saw you at the hand, Mrs. Jean. Yes, you're welcome.
Sorry?
Pardon me. Oh, not Mrs.
Me.
Jean. Nowadays.
If I may,
Thank you.
Chairperson.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So I think that that's a beautiful segue into the second dimension that I wanted to speak about. So, you know, I spoke about the biophysical and what might be the sort of touch points there for women. And on the biophysical side, I do just want to say something about this disaster framing. So when we think climate change, we think disasters. And actually, those disasters are going to be normal. That's the point about climate change. It is changing the planet we live on and what we are accustomed to. So a thing that we used to think about as an exception and a disaster, you know, will be how the world is. And we sometimes then also forget the other aspects of climate change, which are the slow burn things. You know, they're not the extreme weather event, it's just heat. You know, and if you think about heat, what is that going to do to the three areas of water, food, and health? You know, water is going to evaporate faster, and so there's going to be less of it around in most places. You know, food, the heat is going to impact the types of crops that can grow and how much they produce. And that affects women in particular. And in terms of the health, you know, if you have somebody who has heart conditions or other kinds of chronic conditions, heat makes a lot of those things worse. Heat and changing rainfall patterns also brings diseases that we have eradicated in South Africa, like malaria, brings them back. And are our health systems, mainly populated by women, you know, ready to cope with those kinds of things? So, okay, so I think we have to mind shift a little bit from climate equals disasters. Of course, we'll always need disaster management, but we've got to start thinking it's business as usual to have those things. But I want to talk about the economic side, if I may, sir. You know, worldwide, there is a shift in economies away from economic activities which produce the emissions that drive climate change. Now, Pemi is well aware of the issue of, you know, the geopolitical inequality between countries and who needs to move first or slower on you know, shifting out of these high emitting sectors and into low carbon sectors. So, yeah, I mean, mindful of that we are a developing country and our shift can be slower. Nevertheless, these global shifts are impacting on us. Nobody's going to be buying our internal combustion engines. What is going to happen to all those jobs in the Eastern Cape? So, you know, the other arena where I think this is going to hit women in particular ways and where we need intentional addressing of women's perspectives and needs is in the energy sector. And the way women use energy and what we need it for and so on. And then that also raises a lot of the things that have already been spoken about at this conference, the issue of women's economic empowerment as these economies shift. So it's a seismic shift of world economies and South Africa's history. That is a big opportunity. That is a big opportunity to do it differently this time and to make sure we insert women and obtain gender parity in these emerging sectors. I'll talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Mpumalanga. The Climate Commission is working with stakeholders in Mpumalanga to try to diversify the economy there, because Mpumalanga's economy is coal and all, the value chain of coal, not just coal mining, and then it's tourism and agriculture. So, we are looking at, as the coal sector shrinks over time, not immediately, but over time, we want to be sure the jobs are in place for people to go to before that even happens. And with stakeholders in the province, we've identified building out 3 existing sectors, which is citrus, wood, and tourism, and then 3 new sectors: industrial hemp, sustainable aviation fuel, that could be the saving of Sasol, by the way, and agrivoltaics are all new opportunities. But now here's the thing, there's a very gendered element to the existing jobs in the coal value chain, which are mainly occupied by men, coal miners, coal truckers, etc. And these new potential opportunities, which could just as well be occupied on a gender parity basis. So, how are we ensuring that we insert women into these new economic opportunities? And I agree with you, it starts with girl children being aware of those opportunities being open to them. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, can I take questions and then let you engage further then? Yes, can we have 4 questions, please, from our audience? We have 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Yes. Our first question will be from Madam here.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you to the panelists. My name is Hotatso Smela, and I'm here from the Open Government Partnership, but also just as an activist, someone who cares very deeply about these issues and who has been in this space for many, many years. I was very excited to hear about this panel and sort of centering this issue of climate change and the gendered impacts, and I've appreciated the different perspectives that have been shared and insights. But one of the things I'm really grappling with is in hearing the different inputs, is trying to get a sense of, it's been useful to get a sense of what the status quo is and what some of the issues are. But I think the struggle that I'm having, and perhaps for many, that are not directly working in this space on a day-to-day basis, is getting a sense of, when we talk about the gender or the just transition, how do we, first of all, locate ourselves in that discourse beyond a theoretical sort of understanding and appreciation that all these impacts, the biophysical, the socioeconomic, and so forth, are very much gendered? How do we locate ourselves in the discourse for advocacy purposes and for opportunity? Because you're absolutely right. There are significant opportunities that are emerging in terms of women's economic empowerment. There are already some women actors and alliances that have been established, not just in South Africa, but that extend beyond into the continent around this issue of the energy space, and all the opportunities that come downstream in terms of the value chain. So there are some things happening there. But I think more broadly, and for me, particularly when we talk about climate finance, I think one of the biggest disappointments is that my sister was sharing how in terms of NDCs and the negotiations happening in multilateral spaces. South Africa's done quite well insofar as meeting the targets around representation and inclusion of women's voices and participation. But where we are not, and this is where it comes to me, the issue becomes burning to say, where do we influence, how do we engage with it to influence our just transition, has to do with climate financing. So a very practical question I would pose is, to what extent is, in the context of our NDCs, is there a reflection of targets that would come from for instance, a gender, an action plan for gender, which is, I think, one of the things that was identified as a priority at the multilateral level for countries to do. To what extent is that really interrogating the sort of financial impacts, and from using a climate finance lens, or inserting gender in terms of climate finance? That's the one. To what extent, then, I would love to hear, are those engagements including civil society actors, women's organizations that are organized, that are engaging, that are influencing? So I guess I'm trying to, I don't know if I've been coherent, but I'm trying to have a very practical understanding. So when we move towards resolutions, you know, and assisting and being thought leaders here with the CGE, we can say, okay, based on our understanding of the status quo, here are the opportunities, here are entry points, here are there significant gaps. Climate financing is a huge issue that we're not talking very much about, actually, and it's a critical one, especially from a gendered perspective. You know, these are the sort of the steers we're giving to the Commission to follow on, and that we as actors can also follow on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
for indulging me.
There's one question here. Yes, it's you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for this input. Janine Hicks from the School of Law at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The first issue is, and it's rightly so, that we're seized by issues of climate change, and we've heard from the panelists about how women are in that survival space around navigating the impact on food and water, but also managing and being the caretakers of natural resources and ensuring sustainable resources of land and water of their vegetable gardens. So they're at the forefront of that, yet they're excluded from the consultation processes on mitigation of the impacts of climate change. They are excluded from leadership and representative structures in that regard. So we talk about having good policy. I think there's a policy silence and a gap. There should be a requirement that no process or structure can continue in the absence of women. Let's just have that legislated, embedded in policy. If this comes your team of negotiators and there are no women here, send them back. Thing number one. It's time to be bold. We can't wait 150 years, for heaven's sake. And then the second thing is we neglect the everyday environmental injustices. So we focus on, it's sexy, climate change, UN, everything. What about poor women living adjacent to polluters? What about industries that pollute water and rivers where women need to draw water to care for their families? What about women whose families are exposed to emissions from the Sasol and our petrochemical companies? We have bylaws, but municipalities are not holding industry accountable. And a further gap is when we look at vulnerable categories like waste pickers, women who make a living with families on landfill sites, recycling, playing such an invaluable role in the recycling. Because we have inadequate recycling policies at the municipality level, we don't have safe spaces for women and waste pickers to do recycling. There are no environmental protections, and these are violations of our Section 24A right to have a safe environmental space that's not impacting negatively on their health and well-being. So these are two further considerations I'd like to be included. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner, and then we will have the last question.
Not just in terms of shelter, but in terms of basic human rights like water. You speak of policies. Your climate change policies needs to speak Was I audible enough for you? Okay. Your climate change policies and your disaster management act is not in sync. That's evident. I hear you when you say about funds being available. There is adequate funds. Where is that funds? Because when disaster occurs, there's an amount of funds that's allocated to, let's use KwaZulu-Natal, for example. The province has faced so much in the last 4 years. Most recent is the tornado. But they are still suffering the after effects of the floods that happened in 2020, which further exacerbated the situation that's unfolding in the province. Water remains a critical issue. Dr. Hicks spoke about sanitation. There are homeowners who have complained of, sewage, raw sewage running through their houses. Now, what we need to ask ourselves is that those policies that you have at climate change level, how does it address the issue as and when a disaster occurs? Is it gender sensitive? Are we looking at issues as housing? Are we looking at schools that are destroyed? Are we looking at food, health, right to health care? I mean, a thing like a tornado was an unheard of phenomenon, but it happened. And we were not ready. Whether it came from the private sector, whether it came from whichever sector, short-term insurances were literally on their knees. So what it says to me is that our policy is not speaking to our act, and that is what we need to get aligned. And we cannot discuss climate change and leave out disaster management. Thank you.
Thank you. And our fourth question, yes, thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Mzi Nduna, and I think my question follows on the comments that have been made by colleagues, because if we are to plan for an appropriate response, I think we need to kind of have more discussion on the problem and the status quo. And it's in relation to a statement that says, for example, women are not disproportionately affected by climate crisis, but are differently affected. And I want to argue for both, that women are both differently affected, but also disproportionately affected. So it is true that both men, women, and gender diverse people have the same exposure to climate crisis. However, the response, the ability to bounce back when we have experienced the extreme hydrological circumstances of either too much heat or too much flooding, the response is different in relation to women. We saw the response in relation to the crisis for COVID-19, for example. A lot of women did not get the support that they were supposed to get. A lot of women were at the back foot. And in all crises, whether it is conflict situation, whether it is COVID-19, whether it is climate crisis, we see exactly the same thing. Women lose their jobs and income, and because they already hold precarious jobs, they are more likely to lose their jobs compared to men in these circumstances. Women who depend on agriculture for livelihood, for example, there is research that demonstrates that they are less likely to receive agricultural inputs following a disaster compared to men in their communities. So this does put women at the back foot. And we agree that there will be interrupted clinic services, for example, but with interrupted healthcare services, women are not only differently affected, but also they are disproportionately affected, because there are certain services that over and above the services that everyone will need, women are going to need those. So if the bridge has collapsed because of flooding, everybody cannot get to the clinic, so they can't get services. It's true, but women can't get emergency services for, morning after pill for pregnancy, for example. So they will fall pregnant and they would not have. So the physiological differences that we spoke about yesterday, we need to carry through that conversation about what is it that is particularly going to only affect women, that will never affect men. So abortion services, for example, that will only affect women. And in our country, we already have a very long queue of, waiting queue for abortion services. So if you could not get there because of the floods, then you are unlikely to get that. You mentioned malaria and other diseases that may come back as a result of the extreme weather conditions, and it's true. But it is only women who will experience placental malaria. Men will not experience that. It is only women who will experience eclampsia. There are certain diseases and conditions that over and above what everybody will experience, women will have more of. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Can we-
Madam, I think yours is more of a comment than a question. And we will allow our panelists to comment on your statement. That will allow us to allow you opportunity. Ma'am, I saw you wanted to ask a question. Yes, can we have the question?
Yes, I think it's a contribution about the gap. I think in South Africa, as it's been deliberated, that we have so many policies and strategies and treaties that we align to. And we end up romanticizing the poor people in these beautiful hotels. Same by the black people, like copying and pasting the vicious cycle of the oppressor. And I think issues of environmentalism have to do with elitism. It's very elitistic in its framework. And my heart is paining. I'm a villager. I studied in Canada. I'm from the beautiful mountains of Drakensberg. It's beautiful, and we must not romanticize the remoteness of the rural communities. So in future or in your planning, I think the gap in your discourse is the indigenous knowledge systems, and also who owns the weather forecast of South Africa. Where does it come from? Who's got access to it? So I represent the civil society, and thanks to AIDS Foundation, because they have the ability to go to the grassroots level and make things that we were not aware of to become so visible. So these policies, honestly, are just like elitistic in its own nature, and they are not relevant to a villager whose husband is a migrant worker and is retaining a village family. And we need those village communities. So I would like to call upon this commission to recognize the traditional authority, the traditional leaders, and our rural communities and rural women. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I think given that we have different panelists with different expertise, I wouldn't want to impose a question. I think it would be best for the panelists to answer the question. You saw they didn't direct the question to any of the panelists. So I think you are welcome to indicate maybe who would like to start with what question. We have at least 4 questions and a comment. Thank you. Over to you, Madam.
Yes, thank you very much. I think from what has been said, we are talking to the converted. That's number one, right? And I think everyone here agrees that we have a lot of policies, plans, acts, and strategies. But what is lacking is now the implementation thereof. And the implementation is not only by the people who have drafted the policies, but people on the ground, the locals, the local communities, the private sector, and so on. The government does policies to create a space, a regulatory space for policies to be able to be implemented. But having said that, we also need to move beyond just talking. And this is something that I said when I started, and I said, we have policies, but we need to move beyond just talking to the implementation. Yesterday, when other panelists spoke, they spoke about how women also perpetuate the abuse of other women. And I'm saying, even from the discourse on climate change and issues like that, we need not be quiet as women, especially when policies are being drafted, and not wait for it to be enacted and say there's a problem with that policy. When it is out for commenting, then we need to comment boldly. and not just wait for it to be enacted and then say there's a problem with that policy. Why it is been given for public consultation, it's so that the gaps can be filled by the people on the ground. That's exactly why the public consultations and why a policy of such would be, given for comment. Now, in terms of the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, you would recall I said that the previous NDC that was submitted was very silent on the gender inequality, the disproportionately of women and how climate change differently affects them. Now, with the new, with the next NDC, that is still to be done. It's still at a developmental state, and this gives us an opportunity to make a difference. It gives us an opportunity to say, here are the gaps, and this is where we can close them. And I think from what we have learned to where we are going, we can be able to make a difference. And it's not only from us as the policymakers able to make that difference, but from each and everyone who is here that will be able to help us to make that difference. On the just transition as well, if we're talking about the just transition and we're saying it must be just, it must be inclusive, it must be equitable, we're already taking into cognizance the importance of including women in the justness of the transition, in ensuring that even as women move into informal trading, they are being educated into whatever green economy that we're moving into. For an example, if you're looking into the formal economy that women have been involved in, now we're talking about how do we capacitate them as we move from, as we transition to a green economy. Those are the things that we need to start to talk about. And I like what the last speaker spoke about when we need to stop romanticizing when things are not done right. But we need to go out there to the community and capacitate, make them aware, and take them along. And take also the issues of indigenous knowledge systems, which is something that is very important because women are the first point of response, even when disasters hits, or any other thing like that, or are the first people to feel the brunt.
And what would be the role of the traditional leaders here in addressing the same question?
I think the traditional leaders need to be on board as well, because they have a significant role in ensuring that women take a center stage in decision making. And I think they need to be able to know that. If you look at your Queen Mujajis, how they are the ones who were at the forefront of leadership, and even the women of 56, how they were the ones who ensured that decisions are transformed. Then there's nothing stopping traditional leaders from being engaged on such issues. I thank you.
Thank you. You can go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you. I like the fact that South Africa has got at least 50% being women when we are going to conventions and discussing these policies. But I don't think it's still fair. We've got more than 50% of this population being women. Just the other day, when I was on a flight back from Cape Town, I read an article that says 60% of mortgages that has been approved in the last year is by women. So which means women own 60% of properties. Marginalized as they are, but they still do it. And most of them, we know they do it because they have to take care of their children. It's a home for their children. So we really need to be a bit ambitious and stop this 50-50 because we are not, the population of South Africa is not 50% male and 50% female. There are more women in this country. There is a study that was done I think 3-4 years ago that actually said women generally spend 80%, if not more, of their earnings at home. Most men don't spend 50% of their earnings at home. So we cannot want to be equal. We just need to be a bit more. The other thing, I think, as a state, we have not done so well. How many of these policies are actually in indigenous languages? I've not heard my mother telling me that they were called at the chief's crawl because there is a climate change policy that is being discussed. And the chiefs and the traditional leaders have got a huge convening power. They know how to get their people there and talk to them and make them understand. So we need to fix those basic things. Very few of our people know that you should not build, they don't know that you should not build a house next to a river. If they knew, nobody wants to be flooded. There's no one who wants their house to be taken by floods, you know. So the location of where they live, and hence my earlier statement that, this requires a multi-pronged approach. Human settlement needs to come to the party and make sure that we provide our people with human settlement, not houses, which means there must be schools, there must be shops, there must be places of work, there must be play areas, there must be recreational, there must be proper schools in a community where people live. Now, if a woman who wakes up at 4 o'clock and leaves school for her children to cross the river on their own to go to school when she's going to her temp job where she's badly paid, who's going to take care of those kids when there's no housing? It means she can't go to work. There's no place. She stops working to look after her children. And those are not the people in the suburbs. Those are not the people in the township. They are the people in the villages. They are the people who just literally have built their mud hut, if not their mud house, with their bare hands. So we need to just fix the basics and make sure that we are all aligned. And it's said that, we also have to admit that we're talking to ourselves.
Thank you. Yes, over to Ms. Kim.
Yes, I'll try and respond to a number of questions I heard. The one point I'd like to make is that who makes policy? I think you'll assume that it's the two ladies next to me that make policy from the National Commission and from, but actually I want to go just what happens before that. Quite often our policy is made by very technical people, engineers, scientists, consultants, universities, etc., predominantly men. And so there is a growing body of knowledge and research that is arguing for us to move beyond a technological lens and an economic lens when we talk about sustainable development, responding to climate change, etc. And that body of knowledge is arguing that we need to bring more social scientists into the room. So we need to hear the voice of the social workers, the teachers, the health workers, whoever. And then when we are making reference to indigenous knowledge, there is also a voice that needs to be brought into the room. What do you know about growing potatoes? And how are your potatoes impacted if there's too much water? Do bugs get into them? I once had a conversation with somebody who was working for the Department of Agriculture who was telling me how strict the European Union is on importing our potatoes if any little bug gets into them. And that applies to many of our food production processes. So we need the social scientists, we need the geographers, so those people who know what's happening geographically from the weather forecasting points of view or from the climate physical points of view, the scientists. And we also need the legal minds, because when we're talking about energy justice, when we're talking about a just transition, if people out there the communities at large know that they have rights, the more they know that they have rights, whether they're rights of distribution, whether they're rights of procedure, etc., the more we can become, and we have started to see it happening in South Africa. We're starting to see, it's still small, but we're starting to see some litigation happening where people are realizing that I can go take this big corporate on for a fight because they are emitting in my backyard or whatever the case may be. So I think legal experts and many other professions, it really needs to be beyond just the traditional people that have informed our policy. And then I think in answer to the question of the voice of women, I have worked for many years with business, with the private sector and with government. And one of the policy-making strategies, as I understand it, is a formal one, which goes through NEDLAC, where you have your business, government, and communities. I'm not sure who sits there representing communities, and labor. So there is a question I always have in my mind as to where do we have a collective voice of women if we want to talk about a gender mainstreaming perspective? And especially when women are so diverse, because we have rural women, we have township economy women, we have urban women, we have professional women. So how do we consolidate the voice of women in a way that speaks for each of those different components of women and gives forth an input? Because Pemi is right, there are opportunities for consultation, public consultation. People do get to express their views on certain platforms, but we're not always sure how the process works in terms of those opinions and suggestions being taken on board. Sometimes it's he who has the biggest or the deepest pockets that is most likely to probably be heard than those who have no money at all. And then I'd like to just maybe end on saying that I think the CEO mentioned earlier something, what was it about? It sparked my mind in terms of long-term planning, because we do have a tendency quite often to be reactive. And if we think long-term planning, I'd also like to suggest flexible long-term planning, that there's scope for, this has changed suddenly, so how do I... So COVID happened, for example, an unexpected event in all our lives. And what happened? I know, because I've worked with most of the big industries that are situated here in Sandton, they had built huge buildings. And a lot of those buildings are standing empty now. They built energy efficient buildings. They did really upscale type of buildings. But a lot of them are not being populated because COVID made people aware that they could work from home. And suddenly we had a very different trajectory. So similarly, when we think about planning for the future, we need to say that if we can see that through disasters, our storm drainage is not suitable anymore, we need to start thinking long-term. How do we now start replacing those small pipes for bigger storm drainage so that it can absorb the water? How do we stop building very concretized complexes so that there's nowhere for the water to go? How do we start putting more trees, more grass, more whatever that absorbs the water? Those sorts of things. How do we think about fire breaks? How do we think, and then I want to also speak to what Louise was mentioning about the opportunities, because all too often we think, oh, woe is me, disaster. There's also opportunities. But, and this is what we found in our own research as well, that women said, 77% of the women who responded said, we don't know what those opportunities are. So it's very important as well that we make it tangible. We say, what do we mean by an opportunity? So, for example, if we're talking about renewable energy, what are the opportunities in the whole value chain of renewable energy? At the extraction, because there is extraction, it may be renewable, but we are going to extract copper and cobalt and lithium and stuff from the ground. So if we're extracting, what does that mean for women? And I come back to an earlier point made about the fact that it might impact you negatively because they're going to dig right in front of your house, or someone's going to emit their pollution or their emissions right in front of your house. But alternatively, can you see yourself as a woman or your daughter educating them to say, well, there's a role for you. You can play in your civil engineering space or in whatever kind of work you do to assist at that life cycle of the business. There's a production phase, there's a distribution phase, there's a storage phase, there's a consumption phase. Where in all those parts of the life cycle of any business can you spot the opportunities? And we need business to tell us that. We need the entrepreneurs to tell us that. And we need to then communicate that. And then you've got something to say as a woman, because you can say, well, but I can drive a truck, or I can make a truck, or I can build a train, or, you know, those are the different tangible things. And I think it's only when we start to understand things tangibly. And I think a lot of us learn by seeing and doing. So not just from our textbooks, but going to a site and seeing that this is what I could do. This is a job I could do. And here's then what I need in order to prepare myself to do that work. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Ms. Naude. I was hoping you could also cover the role of the caretakers or the custodians of the natural resources was one of the questions, and climate finance. Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to thank the comments and the questions that came from the floor, because you certainly are enriching the debate. And I particularly want to thank the person, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, ma'am, who made, you know, more nuance of the point I was making about different exposures and vulnerabilities of men and women. You're right. Women are more on the back foot, and so the impacts are, there are more greater vulnerabilities. Thank you for bringing that up. I also thought the point about indigenous knowledge was very important, because indigenous knowledge comes from a time when we were more in tune with our environment, and so, you know, there's absolute riches to be had in indigenous knowledge about how to live in harmony with nature as humans. So I really think that has to be elevated and brought into how we deal with this. In terms of disasters, okay, so the Climate Commission is working with the disaster management people in government. They're busy developing a new disaster management strategy. And so we're trying to, you know, work together to ensure the climate dimensions are accounted for there. And the president has put up a fund called the Adaptation Fund, which will precisely address some of the issues the commissioner was raising about where do we find the money when these disasters do happen. That we, you know, and PEMI would be going into the global negotiation system to get what is called loss and damage money for South Africa. It's when you know, loss and damage is when you were really unable to adapt to a climate change, and you're now faced with the consequences of that. I think what's really important to think about in response to climate changes is resilience. So there's adapting to, but there is also just building the resilience of the system. And some of what you were saying, for example, about stormwater drains, is that longer term thinking to be resilient in the face of these impacts. And we're doing a lot of work as the Commission on resilience, and also what will be the costs of adaptation. There's a Just Energy Transition Partnership implementation plan, which costed what money does South Africa need for mitigation in the energy system, but we want to also cost what money does South Africa need for adaptation and resilience, so that we know exactly. But I want to turn back to gender. Also, just to say, there is a vibrant civil society movement engaged on climate change issues. And I really would, if anyone wants to connect with them, you know, please get my contact. I'm very happy to connect you with those networks. And, you know, they are also working at really local levels down on the ground. The issue of gender and climate change, I think there is a gap. There is not a coherent and agreed and well thought through agenda for gender in climate. Climate has to get into all your gender work because that's the world you're going to be living in. You've got to think climate. but gender has to get into the climate world. And there isn't a well-articulated agenda for what are we campaigning for, what is our advocacy. And so, I really would appeal that maybe we can start with a meeting between the Gender Commission and the Climate Commission to discuss how are we going to develop such an agenda. But we also need, and I go back to my own roots as a gender activist back in the 1980s, we need a women's movement, and we need that at national level and at local levels. I'm in a project at the moment working with women at grassroots level in Emalahleni. But, these things need not to be little fragments everywhere. It needs to be a coordinated, the voice of women, because we can't insert our voice into policy and other realms if we haven't agreed an agenda amongst ourselves. What are we going to be calling for? What are we going to be building? So that's my clarion call.
Thank you for bringing also the resolutions and the way forward to it. It seems useful. So I will say at least we have 2 minutes each for us to say what is the way forward for the country given the 30 years that we have been in this journey. So I will, in reverse, then start with Ms. Jane. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So the current, I must also just perhaps go back to something I said earlier. When we did the assessment of policies, it wasn't for the sake of criticism. It was for the sake of assisting government to say, have a look at yourself in the mirror, see what you're missing. And I must say, I know PIMI's unit started, improving on their work, and they continued to do that on their own. We worked with the Department of Women. We said, let's see you become a much more active agent. But in terms of the way forward, I think that while we say we may not need money or we do need money, I think money is always important for various things, but how we spend the money is important. So from an implementation perspective, those policies need to become plans, and plans that are realistic, that are based on what people actually need, what will actually help people go forward. And so the work we are focusing on at the moment, and I say we as in UNIDA, but we've got a very short-term time frame, is to help capacitate government in terms of thinking about those plans in more detailed ways, with indicators, to be able to say, we'll know that we've arrived or reached this target. And then we're also talking about budgets, that there needs to be a budget assigned to that. I'm not aware that most government departments have a gender person, but I know the organization I work for, there's a gender unit, and every single one of our projects goes through that gender person. And they have to say, did you say anything about women in there? And the same should apply to us in our different organizations. And then in terms of a last point I'd like to leave, I read an interesting journal article that was taking a perspective of 25 years of gender mainstreaming since Beijing. And one of the things it was saying was we've got a challenge with research. And there's a graph they show where I think there's about 117 research papers produced in the UK compared to our 21, for example, in South Africa. So we're not keeping active in terms of research. We need data. We really do need data. We need to know what's happening in the Eastern Cape vis-a-vis in Mpumalanga. And then that helps us to make informed decisions. We also need a closer partnership between the researchers at universities and the practical policy practitioners out at large to say, well, you've done the study, now tell us what it means for us. Or what do you need to know so that it informs our research? And that was it's just one of the findings that they did after looking at a whole lot of research that had been conducted over the years, that research needs to come to the party and it needs to inform our decision-making and our policies. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think to Dr. Heck's point, maybe CGE should make a commitment today to advise government to actually make it into law, that every APP, every budget that does not have a gender line, an item, it should not be approved. So, because we do talk about these things, we have been forever and ever. We've got Women's Day and all nice things that we say, but the implementation does not happen. And one thing that I've noticed that South Africans, even the government as a whole and the technocrats, they respond well to law. It's unfortunate that everything has to be legislated and put into bills and laws for things to happen, but I think it's high time we have that when it comes to gender mainstreaming. Women are the backbones of our country, probably even the world, and they are the most resilient ones. I mean, I mentioned the stats about them being not even 10% of executives in this country, but still owning more houses than men. It says a lot. Can you imagine if more of them can be given space or room, you know, to actually say their say, including those that are less educated, because the people that are less educated have got that knowledge, that the indigenous knowledge. There are things that we now buy at discount. And for us, we grew up, our parents picking them up in the backyard and boiling it and we drink for flu. I mean, during COVID, Lingana was just made so popular and now it's even in the shelves of, like, you know, African potatoes, you name them, the list is endless. Alu, you know, something you could just cut in the backyard. So they've got that knowledge and they can even add value to all our policies and the direction that we want to take. So I guess from me is inclusivity, inclusivity, inclusivity.
Thank you very much. I think for me, what would be a parting line is for us to take is implementation, implementation, implementation. Right? And I'm saying this, that we need to be able now to take a stand for creating effective, equitable solutions that consider the most vulnerable, amplify underrepresented voice, and forge a path towards a more just, sustainable future. And that can be done by all of us. I thank you.
Thank you. A distinguished guest, we need indeed to appreciate the participation of our panelists for a very fruitful engagement. Can we give them a round of applause once again, please? Indeed, we believe that we have taken a lot from them, and it is clear that research and data is needed in this environment. Gender budgeting is essential and should be taken into account, as well as implementation, as emphasized over and over again. And also, it seems collaboration is necessary. That meeting of CGE and the Climate Commission is overdue. So with those words, I really appreciate your participation, and we're looking forward, and we had a very fruitful discussion. I'll then hand over back to the actual program director. Thank you.